Hey everyone, and welcome back. Have you ever been eating something and just paused and wondered, how did this get here? I mean, the journey it took. Because that trip, it spans entire continents, different cultures, and massive economies. So today, we're going to dig into the huge, complex systems that manage to feed billions of us every single day.
So let me just ask you, straight up, where does your food really come from? And no, I don't mean the supermarket on the corner. I mean, what kind of farm was it? What country was it in? And what kind of economic and environmental choices went into growing it the way they did?
You know, the answer is almost always way more complicated than we think. Behind a simple apple, there's this incredible story of global economics, of ancient traditions, and of super advanced technology. And to understand that whole story, it all boils down to one simple question about why we farm at all.
So here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at the two basic worlds of farming. Then we'll dive into agricultural intensity, which is basically a fancy way of saying how hard we actually farm the land. After a quick world tour of different farm types, we'll see how geographers map all this stuff out, and finally, we'll tie it all together to look at farming's massive global impact. Let's get into it.
All right, let's start with the biggest, most important idea. You've got to understand that pretty much all farming on Earth can be split into two major camps, and the difference between them comes down to one simple question. Why are you farming? On one side, you've got subsistence farming. The easiest way to think about this is like cooking a meal for your family. The whole point is to eat it yourselves. Then, on the other side, you have commercial farming. That's like running a restaurant. The goal is to sell the food and make a profit. Family versus profit. That's it. That's the fundamental split.
Okay, so let's zoom in on subsistence agriculture for a sec. This is all about being self-sufficient. We're talking about small plots of land, often worked by hand, where the farmer's own family is the main consumer. The goal here isn't to get rich, it's to have food on the table. It's really all about survival.
And then you've got the flip side, commercial agriculture. This is farming as big business. Think huge, sprawling farms, heavy machinery, and a single-minded focus on producing as much as possible to sell in the market. This is the engine that stocks the shelves of your local grocery store. But just knowing why someone is farming, well, that's only half the story. The other really important dimension is how they're farming. And that brings us to something called agricultural intensity, which is really just about how much food we're trying to squeeze out of a given piece of land. And just like before, this splits into two main types. You've got intensive farming, which is all about getting the absolute most output from the least amount of land. Picture a super dense vertical farm in a city, or those incredibly productive rice paddies in Asia. The opposite is extensive farming, getting less food per acre, but doing it across a huge area. The classic example? A massive cattle ranch that stretches as far as the eye can see. Okay, so now we've got our basic building blocks, right? Subsistence versus commercial, and intensive versus extensive. Now for the fun part. Let's see how these ideas actually combine out in the real world. We're going to take a quick tour of a few totally different farm types to see this stuff in action. First up, let's look at shifting cultivation, which you often find in tropical rainforests. This is a perfect example of extensive subsistence farming. What happens is a family will clear a small patch of forest, farm it for themselves for a few years, and then, once the soil starts to get tired out, they just move. They find a new plot and let the old one grow back. It's low yield, but it works really well as long as there aren't too many people around.
Next, let's talk about pastoral nomadism. This is another type of extensive subsistence farming, really common in dry, arid parts of the world. In this case, your survival depends on herding animals like camels or goats. But because there isn't much for them to eat, the herds have to be constantly on the move, searching for food and water. They cover these vast territories, which makes it a classic example of extensive farming. Now let's do a complete 180 and look at plantation farming. This is the very definition of intensive commercial agriculture. You're talking about massive farms, often in developing countries, that are laser-focused on growing just one or two valuable crops, think coffee, sugar, bananas, purely to sell on the global market. The goal here is simple: maximize every penny of profit from every single acre. And finally, here's one you might actually see closer to home: commercial gardening, sometimes called truck farming. This is also a great example of intensive commercial farming. These are the farms that grow fresh fruits and vegetables specifically for cities. They use tons of fertilizer and irrigation on pretty small plots to pump out a huge amount of produce that can be quickly loaded onto a truck and sold in a nearby market.
So we've seen everything from nomadic herders to giant coffee plantations. But why do these different kinds of farming happen in specific places? To figure that out, we need to start thinking like a geographer, because they don't just look at one farm, they zoom out to see the huge global patterns that are at play.
You see, geographers look at farming through a really specific lens. They map out the spatial patterns, literally where is this stuff being grown. Then they analyze the inputs, how much labor, how much money, how many machines are going in. They measure the outputs, what's the crop yield, what's the profit. And most importantly, they connect all of this to the economic impacts, especially that big divide between developed and developing countries.
And that right there brings us to the final and maybe most critical piece of this whole puzzle, connecting all these farming systems to global economics. When you start to compare less developed countries, or LDCs, with more developed countries, MDCs, you see this massive, stark divide in how the world actually grows its food.
This table really puts it all into perspective. Just look at the patterns here. In LDCs, farming is mostly about subsistence, feeding your family. It's incredibly labor-intensive because there's just not a lot of money for machines. And that often means lower yields, mostly just for local use. Now look at the MDCs. It's the total opposite. Farming is a commercial business, driven by huge investments in technology. It's low labor, high capital, and it produces these massive yields that get sold all over the world. See how it works? The two worlds we started with, subsistence and commercial, often map directly onto this global economic divide.
So at the end of the day, what this all really means is that what we grow, where we grow it, and how we grow it, that doesn't just put food on our tables. It's a powerful force that actually reflects and shapes the economic destiny of entire nations. It influences everything from what people eat locally to the huge patterns of global trade.
So the next time you sit down for a meal, just take a second and think about the story on your plate. Is it a story of subsistence or commerce, of human hands or industrial machines? Because as our world, our climate, and our economies keep changing, the really big question is, what story is our food going to tell tomorrow?